"Hold on, I'll get you out," an obese single dad told four chained veterans. This rescue act turned him into the prime target of a ruthless gang. But the criminals had no idea. The obese man they were hunting was about to trigger a ride of 2,000 soldiers. Before we see what happens next, where are you tuning in from today? Let us know in the comments. The 2004 Ford pickup truck rattled as Zane turned the ignition key. It didn't start on the first try, it never did. He leaned his head against the cracked steering wheel, letting out a long, ragged exhale that sounded more like a wheeze. He was a 135-kilogram mechanic who couldn't find a garage willing to hire him. Today made it his fourth rejected job interview in 2 weeks. The shop owner hadn't even looked at his resume. He just took one glance at Zane's massive, sweat-stained frame and told him they didn't have shirts in his size. Zane wiped his greasy forehead with the back of his hand. His chest tightened. Just walking from the shop back to the parking lot had triggered his asthma. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was shattered from when he dropped it that morning, completely dead. "Dad, are we going home?" He looked over at the passenger seat. His 12-year-old daughter, Hazel, sat with her backpack on her lap. She hadn't complained once today, but he saw the way her small hands held an empty plastic wrapper. He had $12 left to his name. "Yeah, sweetie. But let's take a break first," Zane muttered. He wrestled the heavy steering wheel and pulled the truck off the highway, rolling into a deserted interstate rest area. It was 5:15 p.m., the golden hour. Sunlight filtered through the dense pine trees, casting long, dark shadows across the cracked asphalt. The rest stop was completely empty, no cars, no attendants. Just an old brick restroom building and a rusted vending machine humming in the silence. Zane parked behind the restroom, hiding the truck from the main road. He reached into a brown paper bag, pulled out a cold, smashed turkey sandwich, and handed it to Hazel. He watched her eat, the familiar weight of shame pressing down on his lungs harder than the asthma. He felt like a failure, a broken, overweight failure who couldn't even buy his kid a hot meal. He closed his eyes. The shadow of the vending machine stretched across the pavement, but it wasn't the only thing hiding in the dark. Zane thought the deserted rest stop was a safe place to catch his breath. He was about to find out how wrong he was. He heard it before he saw it. A low, guttural groan drifted from the picnic area near the edge of the woods. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. Zane froze. He gripped the door handle, his knuckles turning white. He told himself to start the engine, drive away, mind his own business. But the groan came again, weaker this time, followed by the unmistakable rattle of heavy industrial chain. He stepped out of the truck. The mud squished under his boots as he rounded the corner of the brick building. Hazel followed right behind him, clutching his jacket. Then he saw them. Tied around the base of a massive oak tree were 4 elderly men. They wore faded military jackets, the kind adorned with combat patches from decades ago. But those jackets were now smeared with mud and dark red stains. A thick, rusted steel chain was wrapped around their waists, securing all 4 of them to the trunk. A heavy-duty master lock secured the end of the chain. Hazel gasped, stepping back. Zane rushed forward, his heavy knees hitting the dirt. The oldest veteran, a man who looked to be in his 70s, was slumped over. His face was the color of ash. Hey, look at me," Zane said, tapping the man's shoulder. The veteran slowly raised his head. A name tag on his jacket read Harlan. His breathing was shallow, his lips turning blue. "Gang," Harlan wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. 5 of them took the fund, the veteran donation fund. Zane's eyes darted across the clearing. These men had been robbed. The gang hadn't just taken their money, they had locked them to the tree so they couldn't call for help or contact the police. "I need to call an ambulance," Zane said, reaching for his pocket. Then he remembered. His phone was a spiderweb of broken glass, completely dead. "There's no time, can you unchain us first?" But Zane knew that would be difficult, as his own strength was already fading from the asthma. Just then, another veteran named Garrett started to pass out. Zane reached out and checked the man's pulse. The other 2 elderly veterans started to panic and tried calling Garrett's name to wake him up. Zane did a quick calculation in his head and made his decision. "I'll drive you to the hospital," Zane said, grabbing the chain. "I just need to figure out how to break this lock." Harlan shook his head, his grip tightening on Zane's wrist. "Coming back." Zane stopped. "What?" Harlan pointed a trembling finger toward the bushes. Half hidden under the leaves was a black duffel bag. They were laughing, bragging about the cash, but the driver, He was high. He left the second bag behind. Harlan coughed. Once they realize they don't have all the money, they'll turn those trucks around. They're going to come back to finish this. You need to take your girl and run. Fear hit Zane like a physical blow. A ruthless gang, 5 men, returning to the scene of the crime. And he was standing right in the middle of it, with his 12-year-old daughter. Every survival instinct in his body screamed at him to grab Hazel, jump in the Ford, and floor it out of the rest stop. He was 135 kilograms with terrible lungs. He couldn't fight 5 armed men. If he stayed, he was putting his own flesh and blood in extreme danger. The risk level had just hit the absolute ceiling. He looked at his broken phone. He looked at the black duffel bag in the dirt. "Dad?" Hazel whispered. Zane turned to his daughter. Her wide eyes were locked on him. She wasn't looking at him like he was an unemployed failure. She was looking at him to see what kind of man he really was. Sometimes a whisper from a dying man hits harder than a punch to the gut. "Go," Harlan mouthed, his eyes closing as his chest hitched. Zane stood up, his massive frame cast a long shadow over the chained men. The air was getting colder, but the sweat on his neck was hot. He didn't have a weapon, he didn't have a phone, he barely had enough air in his own lungs. But he had 135 kilograms of mass, and he knew how to use it. Zane chose not to abandon them, but the brutal method he was about to use would push his failing body past its absolute breaking point. Zane scrambled back to his truck, his heavy boots sinking into the mud. He threw open the rusted toolbox in the truck bed and pulled out a 3-foot solid steel bolt cutter. It weighed 15 pounds. For a healthy man, it was a heavy tool. For a 135-kilogram man in the middle of a severe asthma attack, carrying it back 50 meters felt like dragging an anchor across the bottom of the ocean. By the time he reached the chained men, his lungs were screaming. His chest tightened with every step, the wheezing growing louder and more frantic. He dropped to his knees in the mud, his vision blurring at the edges. "Son, you need to breathe," Harlan rasped, his face pale as he watched Zane struggle. Zane couldn't speak. He clamped the massive steel jaws of the cutter around the hardened shackle of the master lock. He squeezed the handles with his hands, but his arms were already shaking. He didn't have the upper body strength left to cut through industrial steel. He had to use physics. Zane shifted his position, planting the bottom handle of the bolt cutter firmly against the hard dirt. He leaned over, placing the center of his chest directly over the top handle. He closed his eyes. Then he let all 135 kilograms of his body weight drop straight down onto the lever. The physical pain was immediate. His ribs groaned under the pressure. His face turned a dark, bruised red, the veins in his neck bulging as his heart hammered against his ribs. The steel lock groaned but didn't give way. "Come on!" Zane wheezed, his breath rattling in his throat. He pushed harder, forcing his exhausted body to crush down on the metal handles. 3 seconds ticked by. 5 seconds. The lock dug into the steel chain, refusing to break. 30 seconds ticked by, then a loud, violent crack echoed through the rest stop. The heavy industrial lock shattered. The chains slithered down the bark of the massive oak tree, finally freeing the 4 elderly men. But exactly as the lock gave way, the steel jaws of the overloaded bolt cutter snapped cleanly in two, a jagged piece of metal clattering against a rock. Zane collapsed forward. He hit the damp grass face first, completely drained. The massive spike in blood pressure and the lack of oxygen finally pushed him over the edge. His chest heaved violently, pulling in empty, ragged gasps that sounded like tearing paper. He couldn't push himself up. He was suffocating on dry land. "Dad!" Hazel sprinted out from the shadows. She dropped to her knees beside him, her small hands frantically digging into his jacket pocket. She pulled out his scuffed blue albuterol inhaler. She jammed it into his mouth and pressed down hard twice. A burst of medication shot into Zane's burning lungs. He coughed, a harsh, wet sound, finally pulling a shallow breath of air. He rolled onto his side, his vision slowly coming back into focus. The 4 veterans were free, but the situation was worse than before. They were a group of broken, exhausted men huddled around a gasping mechanic, and Zane had just shattered his only weapon. They were stranded, exhausted, and defenseless, but what they didn't know was that the golden hour sunlight had just disappeared below the tree line. But before Zane could catch his breath, a low, menacing rumble vibrated through the asphalt. The chains were finally broken. But as the rumble of the gang's vehicles returned, Zane realized the true nightmare had just begun. The glaring headlights of a beat-up pickup truck swept across the wet grass. The gang was back. Zane and the 4 veterans hurriedly grabbed the bag of money and dragged their exhausted bodies through the mud, slipping behind a dilapidated wooden garage hidden behind the main rest stop building. The blinding beams of light cut through the pine needles, casting long, erratic shadows. Heavy leather boots crunched on the gravel. A string of vicious curses echoed through the trees as the men discovered the shattered padlock and the empty oak tree. Zane slumped against the wooden siding of the garage. He still couldn't stand properly. His asthma attack had drained his remaining strength, and his inhaler was completely empty. Through the cracked wooden slats of the garage, they saw a stroke of luck. Parked inside was an old maintenance truck, the keys dangling from the ignition. But the heavy rolling door was padlocked from the inside. There was only one way in. A rusted ventilation window sat 8 feet off the ground, near the roofline. No adult could fit through it. Zane was 135 kilograms. The veterans were too old and frail. The only person small enough to squeeze through the narrow gap was a 12-year-old girl. Hazel looked up at the high window, then back at her father. Putting her in danger was the ultimate cost, but time was running out. Zane grabbed his daughter's arm, shaking his head, but Hazel had already made up her mind. 2 of the veterans linked their hands together, forming a shaky human step. Hazel climbed onto their palms, boosting herself up to the high window. She squeezed her small frame through the tight, rusted opening and dropped down into the pitch-black garage, landing softly on a pile of old, musty rubber tires. The air inside smelled like decaying rubber and dust. Hazel fumbled through the darkness, her hands trailing along the cold concrete wall, searching for the motorized door switch. Bang, bang, bang! Hazel froze. Someone was violently pounding on the outside of the garage door. One of the gang members was patrolling right past the building. If she hit the button now, the screeching of the old rolling door would alert the entire gang. She had to mask the noise. Outside, a gang member revved a loud, modified truck engine, trying to intimidate the area. Hazel forced down her terror. Her small, scraped fingers hovered over the plastic switch. She held her breath, counting the seconds, waiting for the exact moment the engine flared. "Wait for it, wait now!" The truck engine roared outside. At that exact second, Hazel smashed the button. The heavy metal door rolled up, revealing their only ticket out of this nightmare. The men quickly ducked under the rising door and scrambled into the garage. They had a vehicle and a way out, but outrunning a gang of predators in a rusty pickup truck was a deadly game of cat and mouse. Zane hauled Harlan into the truck bed, the old man pale and fading fast. Beams from tactical flashlights were already sweeping under the gap of the rolling garage door. Zane threw himself into the driver's seat and turned the key. Click, 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 click. The starter whined, dry and metallic. The battery was weak. The smell of raw gasoline flooded the cab as Zane pumped the pedal. "Hey, they're in here!" a voice shouted from outside. Heavy boots pounded against the concrete. Through the side window, Zane saw a gang member raise a heavy steel crowbar, preparing to shatter the glass. It just needed one spark. The engine roared to life. Instead of throwing the truck into reverse, Zane jammed the shifter into drive. He mashed the gas pedal to the floor. The heavy truck lunged forward, slamming straight into the flimsy corrugated metal wall at the back of the garage. The truck burst through the rusted metal wall. The windshield cracked in a spiderweb pattern. Jagged pieces of rusted metal tore Zane's jacket to shreds, but the truck launched out onto the bumpy grass, breaking out of the trap. They were free, but the blinding headlights of pursuit vehicles instantly locked onto them. Zane whipped the steering wheel, aiming the truck toward the highway ramp. But the gang was fast. 2 heavily modified sports cars swung around the perimeter, sliding sideways to block the only exit. In the back seat, Harlan let out a shallow gasp, his heart rate dropping dangerously low. "Think, Zane, think," Zane muttered to himself. He didn't have time to slow down. Suddenly, the front passenger tire hit a rusted spike strip left on the road. The tire blew out with a deafening pop. The steering wheel jerked violently in Zane's hands. The smell of burning rubber filled the air as the rim ground against the asphalt. He couldn't ram through the steel barricade of the sports cars with a blown tire. The truck would flip. The highway ramp was blocked. The only way left to go was deeper into the trap. Zane yanked the steering wheel a full 180 degrees. The crippled truck drifted wildly, screeching back toward the center of the rest area. He aimed straight for the abandoned diner building, the only solid structure left. Sparks flew as the bare metal rim ground against the pavement. The truck violently slammed into the concrete steps of the diner, shuddering to a halt. "Everybody out! Move!" Zane yelled, kicking his door open. Hazel and the veterans scrambled out of the smoking vehicle, helping each other limp toward the dark entrance of the diner. Zane reached into the truck bed and grabbed the broken half of the heavy steel bolt cutter. It was the only weapon they had left. All around them, the deafening roar of engines surrounded the building. Headlights pinned the diner from every angle. The gang members stepped out of their vehicles, dragging baseball bats and heavy chains across the asphalt. The diner's front entrance was made of double glass doors. It offered zero protection. "Hazel." Zane pointed to the back and said, "Take them to the back first, sweetheart." "Dad." "No, go." Hazel swallowed her fear and led the stumbling veterans into the dark kitchen, leaving muddy footprints smeared across the dusty tile floor. Zane stood alone in the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen. He gripped the cold steel of the broken cutter. His lungs were empty. His body was completely exhausted, but he positioned his massive 135-kilogram frame to block the only path to his daughter. But what they didn't know was that Zane wasn't just standing there to fight. Zane stood alone in the dark diner with a broken tool, waiting for the wolves to break down the door. He was out of breath and out of time, but he wasn't out of fight. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the abandoned diner as the gang smashed the front double doors. 4 large men poured into the dark hallway, their boots crunching over the shattered glass. They dragged heavy chains and steel pipes, advancing toward the narrow corridor where Zane stood. A tactical flashlight hit Zane right in the eyes. "Look at this," the leader sneered, pointing a crowbar at Zane's massive, sweat-drenched frame. A fat, useless mechanic, nowhere left to run, big guy. Zane's chest heaved. He had no breath left to throw a punch. His muscles were shaking, pushed completely to their absolute limit. If they got within striking distance, he would go down instantly. But he didn't need to fight them. He just needed gravity. Instead of raising the broken bolt cutter to strike, Zane took a half step back. Beside him stood a massive broken vending machine, towering against the wall. Zane leaned his shoulder against the heavy metal casing. He dug his boots into the dusty carpet. Gritting his teeth, he threw all 135 kilograms of his body weight forward, violently ramming his shoulder into the machine. A sickening pop echoed in Zane's shoulder as the joint dislocated. Pain shot down his spine, but the vending machine tipped forward. The massive machine crashed down with a deafening roar, completely crushing the narrow hallway and blocking the gang's path. A thick cloud of dust erupted from the old carpet, but the gang wasn't going to let a piece of junk stop them for long. The men cursed furiously, scrambling to climb over the crushed metal and shattered glass of the vending machine. Zane clutched his dislocated shoulder, his breathing ragged and shallow. He stumbled backward down the dark corridor, finally reaching the heavy steel fire door at the back of the building. This was where Hazel and the veterans had slipped out into the freezing woods. Zane pushed the door open to follow them, but he noticed a critical problem. The locking mechanism on the heavy fire door was completely destroyed. If he just ran, the gang would push through the door seconds later. They would easily catch up to the frail veterans in the woods. He had to lock this door from the outside. He pulled the heavy steel door shut behind him. Standing in the freezing night air, he looked down at his only remaining tool, the broken steel jaws of the bolt cutter. "One more push, lock it in," he gasped. Zane jammed the thick steel jaws into the narrow gap between the heavy door hinge and the sliding track. He slammed his palm against the metal, forcing the jagged piece deep into the mechanism. His hand blistered red as the cold metal pinched his skin. Metal scraped loudly against metal as the makeshift lock wedged tightly into place. Inside the diner, the gang reached the exit. The gang hammered against the jammed steel door from the inside, but the broken tool held firm, sealing them in the dark. Zane stepped back, his chest tight and his shoulder burning with pain. He turned and vanished into the freezing woods, disappearing into the pitch-black night. Zane had bought them time to disappear into the freezing woods. But as they vanished without a trace, he left behind a broken tool, the only clue to finding the man who risked everything. Red and blue lights flashed against the pine trees. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. It was the police. Smart little Hazel, while leading the old men to safety, had found a nearby public payphone. She had called the police and pleaded for immediate help. The gang had scattered into the night, and the police and ambulances had finally arrived to secure the rest stop. Zane stood in the shadows, looking at his crippled, smoking pickup truck. His insurance had expired 3 months ago. He was broke, unemployed, and terrified that a police background check would somehow flag him as an unfit father. The crushing weight of poverty settled back onto his shoulders. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to protect his daughter. Before the paramedics could reach him, Zane quietly took Hazel's hand. He lowered his head, pulled his jacket tight, and limped away into the thick morning fog. When Harlan woke up on a stretcher and asked for the giant mechanic who saved them, the police officers just shook their heads. The only thing Zane had left behind was the broken half of a bolt cutter jammed tightly in the heavy steel door. He walked away with nothing but a broken truck and empty pockets, thinking his part in the story was over. But the men he had saved refused to let the story end in the shadows. To them, it wasn't just a matter of recovered cash, it was a matter of honor. The man had bled for them, fought for them, and vanished into the night without asking for a dime. They were not going to let him fade into obscurity. Day 3, Day 5, Day 7, time dragged on, but the determination of the Brotherhood only grew. The legend of the wheezing giant, the massive, breathless stranger who stepped into the line of fire spread like a brush fire across the state's CB radio network. Late at night on lonely highways and in crowded truck stops, Channel 19 buzzed with whispers of the man who breathed like a broken engine but fought like a cornered bear. Inside the dimly lit, smoke-stained walls of the local VFW hall, Harlan sat confined to a wheelchair, his legs still wrapped in thick surgical bandages. The room was deathly quiet as he leaned forward and placed their only lead onto the scarred wooden table, a broken bolt cutter. It wasn't some cheap, mass-produced tool you could pick up at a local hardware store. It was a heavy-duty, industrial-grade piece of forged steel. More importantly, it had a distinct, ugly, custom slag weld right at the base of the handle, a makeshift repair job that acted as a unique fingerprint. Using that single piece of metal as their compass, the veterans initiated a massive underground manhunt. This wasn't a police operation, it was a mobilization of the working class. Hundreds of truckers, night shift mechanics, and outlaw bikers began combing through the forgotten corners of the county. They flashed photos of the weld at small-town repair shops, questioned junkyard dogs, and scanned remote gas stations, desperately hunting for a massive, unemployed mechanic plagued by severe asthma. Yet, as the second week approached, hope began to thin. The trail was going cold. Searching for him felt like chasing a ghost in the machine, a phantom who had slipped through the cracks of society, until the breakthrough finally came. Deep in the backwoods, at a rundown, oil-stained auto shop that time had forgotten, an elderly mechanic squinted at a grainy picture of the bolt cutter. A few minutes later, the CB radio inside the VFW hall cracked sharply to life, cutting through the static. I recognized that ugly slag. The old mechanic's voice rasped over the speaker, heavy with years of cigarette smoke. I did that weld myself about 3 years back. That cutter belongs to Zane. Big guy, bad lungs. He's living down at the Starlight, that cheap beat-up motel on the south side of the tracks. The address was instantly written down and slid across the table to Harlan. There was no press release. No newspapers printed the story. No local news anchors smiled and broadcasted the discovery on the evening broadcast. The media didn't care about a nameless mechanic, but the Brotherhood did. This was a strictly private mobilization. The lockbox of money Zane had single-handedly protected from being stolen wasn't just a pile of paper, it was the lifeblood of the community. It held the funds that kept roofs over the heads of disabled veterans, paid for critical medications, and put food on the tables of grieving families. Zane had saved their pride and their survival. They weren't just going to mail the man a polite thank you card. They were going to show him, in person, the sheer weight of what he had done. The call to action was broadcasted in the pitch-black hours of a quiet Sunday morning. 6 a.m. by 7 a.m., the silence of the sleeping city was entirely shattered. The highways were suddenly choked with miles of polished steel, dark leather, and burning gasoline, all converging on a single, rundown motel on the south side. A massive ground-shaking convoy of heavy-duty V8 trucks and roaring, custom-built motorcycles thundered to life. The deafening rumble of their exhausts vibrated through the pavement, shaking the windows of nearby storefronts. Hundreds of men and women, clad in leather jackets heavily decorated with faded military patches and unit insignias, rode shoulder to shoulder. They moved in perfect, disciplined formation, a relentless tide of gratitude. united by a single, unbreakable purpose. They were coming to bring their hero home. The ticking of the cheap plastic wall clock was the loudest sound in the room. It was Sunday morning, though the gray, sickly light filtering through the grime-caked window of the motel made it feel like perpetual dusk. Zane sat at the wobbly kitchen table, his massive, scarred hands carefully breaking a single, dry piece of bread precisely down the middle. He slid the slightly larger half toward his 7-year-old daughter, Hazel, along with a chipped glass of tap water. He then looked down at the pathetic pile of copper pennies and nickels scattered on the peeling formica table. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. He was completely unaware that just miles down the highway a 2,000-strong army of veterans was rolling toward his door. Suddenly, a low, rumbling hum began to vibrate through the thin, damp walls of the motel. At first, Zane thought it was just a passing freight train, but the sound didn't fade. It grew into a deafening, guttural roar. The floorboards trembled beneath his heavy boots. On the table, the surface of his cold black coffee began to ripple frantically until the mug itself started rattling against the wood. Zane stood up, his protective instincts instantly firing. He crept to the window, pulling the moth-eaten curtain back just a fraction of an inch to peer into the parking lot. His heart plummeted into his stomach. The street was entirely swallowed by steel and chrome. Thousands of massive semi-trucks, armored transports, and heavy cruisers had effectively barricaded the entire motel block. A blinding wall of LED headlights and high beams cut through the morning fog pointed directly at the flimsy door of room 114. Panic seized Zane's chest with an icy grip. They found us, he thought. He was absolutely certain the syndicate had finally tracked him down and brought their entire private army for revenge. If it wasn't the gang, it was a militarized police raid coming to drag him away and put Hazel in the system. "Hazel, come here now," Zane whispered. His voice trembled, not for himself, but for the tiny girl looking up at him with wide, frightened eyes. He scooped her up and rushed her into the cramped, musty bedroom closet, pushing aside a few wire hangers. He knelt down to her eye level, gripping her small shoulders. "Listen to me very carefully, sweetheart," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Do not make a single sound. No matter what you hear out there, you stay in the dark. Do you understand me?" Hazel nodded, a single tear cutting a track through the dust on her cheek. Zane kissed her forehead, closed the louvered door, and plunged her into darkness. Walking back into the living room, the giant of a man reached into the corner and picked up a heavy, rust-eaten iron pipe. It was a pathetic weapon against an army, but it was all he had. His massive frame shook with an overwhelming, suffocating despair. But as he planted his steel-toed boots firmly onto the linoleum floor, the shaking stopped. His jaw set. He was going to sacrifice his life to buy his daughter a few extra seconds. He gripped the pipe with both hands and braced himself for the door to be kicked off its hinges. Instead, the deafening roar of the engines outside abruptly cut off. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the motel. Then came the sound of boots on the gravel. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps approaching his porch. They stopped right outside. Thud, thud, thud. 3 crisp, authoritative knocks echoed through the silence. Zane's knuckles turned bone-white around the iron pipe. Baring his teeth, he threw the front door wide open, roaring as he stepped out, completely prepared to fight to his last breath. But there was no gang, there were no police. Standing on his dilapidated porch was Harlan. The old man wasn't wearing the grease-stained overalls from the rest stop. He was dressed in a crisp, immaculate military dress uniform, his chest adorned with rows of heavy, gleaming combat ribbons. Behind him, standing in perfect attention, were the other 3 veterans from the diner, also wearing their respective service uniforms. Zane froze, the adrenaline instantly evaporating from his veins. The heavy iron pipe slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the concrete porch. He looked past Harlan and gasped. Stretching down the street, filling the parking lot, and blocking the highway as far as the eye could see, stood a 2,000-strong army. Bikers in leather vests covered in unit patches, truckers standing on the running boards of their rigs, and old men in worn field jackets. Without a single word spoken, 2,000 veterans simultaneously snapped their right hands up in a silent, perfectly synchronized military salute. Harlan stepped forward, breaking Zane's shock. In his hands he held a heavy olive-drab metal lockbox. With a gentle but firm push, he pressed it into the center of Zane's massive chest. "Open it," the old man commanded, his voice soft but carrying the undeniable weight of a commanding officer. Zane popped the brass latch with violently shaking hands. The lid fell back. Inside sat thick, banded stacks of $100 bills, more money than the mechanic had ever seen in his entire life. Resting gently on top of the cash was a set of heavy brass keys attached to a leather fob. The boys and we pulled some strings, Harlan said, a warm, knowing smile cracking through his weathered face. That right there is the deed and the keys to a 3-bay commercial truck repair shop right off Route 9. It's yours, completely paid for, free and clear. Zane's knees went weak. The hardened, stoic giant who had just been ready to face a firing squad choked back a heavy sob. Hot tears streamed freely down his scarred face, dripping onto his worn shirt. "I can't," Zane stammered, shaking his head. "Harlan, I don't deserve this." Harlan reached out, his hand clasping firmly onto the giant mechanic's shoulder. "You unlocked our chains, son," the old veteran said, his eyes shining with profound gratitude and respect. "It's time we unlock yours." For the first time in his life, the man who had nothing was suddenly given everything by the very people he had risked his life to save. Zane had expected the worst, but instead he was handed a new life. But there is one final lesson in this story that we all need to hear. Exactly 1 year later, the warm, golden morning sun streamed through the large glass windows of a bustling auto repair shop. The air carried the familiar, gritty scent of motor oil, blending perfectly with the lively clinking of metal tools and the rhythmic hum of hard work. Hanging proudly in the center of the office wall, carefully polished and framed behind glass, was a seemingly ordinary object, the shattered steel jaw of an old, heavy-duty bolt cutter. It was no longer just a piece of broken metal. It was a triumphant testament to a life-or-death struggle, a daily reminder of unbelievable resilience. Out on the shop floor, Zane stood confidently under the open hood of a massive semi-truck. The heavy, agonizing, wheezing breaths that had once plagued him were completely gone. Bathed in the morning light, he looked healthy, strong, and full of life. But the most radiant thing about the grease-smudged mechanic was the profound look of peace and happiness on his face. Standing right beside him was little Hazel. She was grinning from ear to ear, her eyes sparkling with absolute adoration and excitement as her father gently held her small hands, patiently teaching her how to grip a heavy, oil-stained wrench. The sweet bond between father and daughter could melt the heart of anyone watching. He wasn't a failure anymore. The man who had once tortured himself with the thought that he was nothing more than a broken, out-of-breath loser had just become the most respected and sought-after mechanic in the entire state. That respect wasn't just earned by his talented hands, but by his unbreakable spirit. Ultimately, a true hero isn't measured by the bulging size of his muscles or the thickness of his wallet. He is measured entirely by the sheer size of his heart. Zane didn't have any elite special training. He certainly didn't have endless stamina or natural athletic prowess. But in that terrifying moment when his little girl and innocent strangers were in mortal danger, he didn't hesitate. He gave everything he had, draining every last ounce of strength in his veins to protect them. True strength isn't about standing tall and never falling down. It is about the courage to get back up, fighting past your absolute limits, even when every single breath tears at your lungs and brings agonizing pain. If you believe that real, everyday heroes come in all shapes, sizes, and circumstances, hit the like button and share this story to inspire someone who might need a little extra strength today. And tell us down in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Zane's shoes during that terrifying moment?